Half the joy of poetry is in reading it out loud, so let's make sure you're doing it well. Hi, it's good to see you again. A few months ago, I was invited to judge a poetry recitation contest at a local high school, and it was actually pretty fun. I really enjoyed watching the students recite poems they had memorized, and I was especially impressed that so many had chosen to recite contemporary poetry. I mean, with all due respect to Mr. Shakespeare, I think a lot more people would like poetry a lot more if they read poems that were actually written sometime this century. But as fun as the experience was, it also got me thinking about all the ways that reading or reciting poetry out loud can go wrong. Probably because, as a judge, it was my job to find the places where it was going wrong. See, poetry has its roots in oral traditions. Poetry was spoken long before it was ever written down, and that orality is key to how poetry works. If you read it silently, or worse yet, speed read it, you're going to miss a lot of what sets poetry apart from other literary genres. So today I'd like to show you how to read poetry, mostly by showing you 3 ways not to read it. And before we begin, I hasten to add that none of what follows is an actual critique of the people who recited poems that day. This isn't a comment on any one of them specifically, but that experience did get me thinking about this larger topic. Also, I should point out that this is really just a discussion of how to recite literary poetry. I don't have anything to say about slam poetry because that's a whole other thing with its own set of rules. So with all of that out of the way, let's start talking about how not to read a poem out loud. Because poetry and nursery rhymes both have rhythm and rhyme, it's easy to get them confused for one another. Unfortunately, because so many people learn to read nursery rhymes before they read poetry, when they do read poetry, they fall into the most inane drumbeat, as if every poem were just another hey diddle diddle nursery rhyme. For example, you might hear someone read Emily Dickinson with such a grating lilt that you'd have a hard time taking it seriously. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm, that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Reading a poem like a nursery rhyme is like making ice cream with expensive vanilla and then drowning it in cheap chocolate syrup. Sure, chocolate can be a good complement to the vanilla, but when all you can hear is the rhythm and rhyme, you'll lose the sense of everything else. A more nuanced reading would keep the rhythm and rhyme in balance with the meaning of the words and the structure of the sentences. So consider how our reading of this poem changes when we do it with an ear for poetry rather than for nursery rhyme. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all, and sweetest in the gale is heard. And sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Here the reading is guided more by the punctuation than by the form, and that's a good thing. The form is a complement to the meaning of the poem, but the form is not the point. So pause when you run into a comma, and pause longer when you meet a semicolon or period, but don't get so wrapped up in the rhythm that you end up singing and then forgetting what the poem is all about. The least experienced readers of poetry will treat it like a nursery rhyme, drowning out all of the nuance with a driving sing-song. Happily, more experienced readers of poetry will avoid doing that, but they'll often fall into a different trap, and they'll make the mistake of thinking that reading a poem means performing the poem. And it might go a little something like this. Behind Stowe by Elizabeth Bishop. I heard an elf go whistling by, a whistle sleek as moonlit grass that drew me like a silver string to where the dusty pale moths fly and make a magic as they pass. And there I heard a cricket sing. His singing echoed through and through and through and through the dark under a windy tree where glinted little insects' wings. His singing split the sky in two. The halves fell either side of me, and I stood straight, bright with moon rings. Sure, it might be a little exciting, but it's also a caricature. We're here to read poetry, not audition for a play, so don't feel the need to shout or conjure a tear or take a long dramatic breath. We want to hear the poet's words, not see your dramatic prowess. The trouble with a dramatic reading like this is that it takes attention away from the poem and puts it on the reader. It also kind of misses the point. Poetry isn't theater, so we shouldn't be reading it like a monologue any more than we should be reading a script like poetry. So we can dial back the drama and honor the poet and her piece with a reading more like this. Behind Stowe by Elizabeth Bishop. I heard an elf go whistling by, a whistle sleek as moonlit grass, that drew me like a silver string to where the dusty pale moths fly and make a magic as they pass. And there I heard a cricket sing. His singing echoed through and through the dark under a windy tree where glinted little insects' wings. His singing split the sky in two. The halves fell either side of me, and I stood straight, bright with moon rings. Here we get to linger in the resonance of the poem, not the reverberations of the performance. Even when a performance is sincere, it can be read as artificial, and that's not what we're after. So let's not cheapen the poem by over-dramatizing it. Where inexperienced readers of poetry default to nursery rhyme and intermediate ones fall into the trap of performing poems rather than reading them, the greatest crime against the reading of poetry might just be the one perpetrated by overly earnest poets when they read their own work. With their tortured souls and black berets, young poets are given to treating each word like crystallized dew from the peak of Mount Parnassus and uttering every line with the gravity of cosmic decree. When they do that, though, their work ends up sounding like scrambled nonsense coupled with insufferable self-seriousness. When I was in poetry school, we called this kind of reading poet voice, and we had a pretty good time making fun of it by reading everyday things like menus and textbooks in this overly exaggerated way. A Jellyfish by Marianne Moore. Visible, invisible, a fluctuating charm, an amber-colored amethyst inhabits it. Your arm approaches, and it opens, and it closes. You have meant to catch it, and it shrivels. You abandon your intent, it opens, and it closes, and you reach for it. The blue surrounding it grows cloudy, and it floats away from you. Get the cadence right, and you'll fool people into thinking that you're a real serious artist. I mean, imagine if you had the audacity to read it in natural language, people might not think you were a genius. They just think you were a normal person with really cool things to say. And of course, that's not what we're after. We have to earn those berets after all. So instead of reading in poet voice, read the poem in your voice. Read it the way a person would say it, the way you would say it. Nobody should be reading in poet voice except maybe MFA students who are reading their own grocery lists. So you might try instead something like this. A Jellyfish by Marianne Moore. Visible, invisible, a fluctuating charm, an amber-colored amethyst inhabits it. Your arm approaches, and it opens, and it closes. You have meant to catch it, and it shrivels. You abandon your intent, it opens, and it closes, and you reach for it. The blue surrounding it grows cloudy, and it floats away from you. So there are all kinds of ways to turn a good poem into a disaster when you read it out loud, but the good news is that each of them requires you to put some kind of extra effort into reading it. So the best thing to do is to read the poem in your own natural voice. That's what poetry is anyway, natural language. Sure, a heightened form of language, but a natural one nonetheless. So here are some principles for reading or reciting poetry out loud more effectively while honoring the poet and their work. Number 1, prioritize meaning. Yes, poetry is attuned to sound in ways that other literary genres aren't, but that doesn't change the fact that the basic function of a poem is to communicate something. That should be the priority, and exaggerated reading styles pull attention away from what the poem is actually about. Number 2, follow the sentence more than the form. Poetry immediately made more sense to me when a teacher I had explained that we should read through line breaks rather than pausing at the end of every line. Lines and line breaks are important tools, and we'll talk about them another day, but they aren't meant to disrupt your reading. When you pause at the end of every line, you break up sentences and make it so much harder to understand what they're saying. Instead, let punctuation be your guide. When you're reading aloud, pretend the line breaks aren't even there. They are doing something important, but what they're not doing is telling you where to pause. That's punctuation's job. Number 3, take it slow. And of course, I don't mean that you should read poetry in slow motion, but I do mean that you can afford to take a slower, more deliberate pace. Poems are short anyway, so why be in a rush? When you listen to poets read their own work, you'll find that they tend to read more thoughtfully and carefully. In fact, I'll link to a few poets reading their own work in the description. Check them out and maybe even tell them I sent you. And fourth, be natural. There's a reason that we go to poetry readings and not poetry performances. You don't need to be someone you're not or put on airs to read poetry. It's not about putting on the best performance or dragging your audience to the edge of their seats. Instead, it's about honoring the language and the subject of the poem. Wordsworth said that poetry comes from emotion recollected in tranquility. There's an evenness and a peacefulness to poetry that ought to be a part of reading it, and even though people accuse poetry of being pretentious, it really isn't. It's just people writing about everyday things in careful but ultimately human ways. So just take it easy and have some fun with it. Poetry really isn't all that it's often made out to be. Anyone can read it and anyone can appreciate it. And in fact, you'll probably appreciate it more when you're reading it well, because then you'll see that it isn't really doing anything more than drawing our attention to the beauties of language and the beauties of the world. So my dear friends, thanks for watching. It really is a treat to spend this time with you, and it's especially delightful to see how many more of you there are week after week. Writing is the good stuff, and poetry is the best of the good stuff, so I hope that you'll come back soon to talk about writing again. In the meantime, though, I think we should all go read some poetry. That actually sounds pretty nice.